Howdy All, and welcome back to another episode of the Sanctified Podcast, the show where we explore the stories of various saints throughout history and learn about what they did and how we came to recognize them as saints today. Today, we're going to explore the life of Saint Ubald Baldassini, a fascinating and dedicated leader. Ubald was born around the year 1085, and he was an only child. His parents were Rivaldo and Giuliana Baldassini, and he was named after his uncle Ubaldo, who actually ended up having to adopt Ubald after both of his parents passed away when he was just a child. Ubald began studying at Saint Secondo, and he grew very attached to the place. He attended other monastic communities, but he never cared for another as much as he did for Saint Secondo. In fact, one of the communities that he spent a good chunk of time at, Saint Mariano, repulsed him so much that he called the clergyman completely immoral. Now, you might be thinking, man, Ubald must have been a very pious guy to think that. Well, he was, but the rule at Saint Mariano was that every clergyman could have their very own concubine. So, yeah, he was probably on page with them being very immoral, and that might even be a little bit of an understatement. In 1104, Bishop Rustico at Saint Secondo passed away, and he was succeeded by Giovanni of Lodi. Lodi wanted Ubald with him at Secondo, but within a year, Lodi passed away as well. Even in Lodi's brief oversight, they were able to reform the community, but almost immediately after the Lodi passed, it kind of just devolved back into its previous ways. Ubald wouldn't stay there any longer without Giovanni of Lodi. And even though his family encouraged him to return to them and start his own family, he felt at home in the church. In 1115, about 10 years after Lodi's death, Ubald was ordained as a priest. And just a few years later, in 1118, he became the prior of Saint Mariano at Gubbio. He secretly, or maybe not so secretly, didn't really want that position, but he couldn't refuse the appointment. In his new position, he worked to reform it the way Lodi had, and he found mixed success in his endeavors. The people of his community grew very attached to him, and they started calling him Praetor Ubaldino. But Ubald didn't really feel like this was the life that he was meant to live. He heard about a community of priests in Porto, and Pietro of the Onesti wrote a rule there in 1116 that Ubald wanted to experience. Ubald's curiosity was piqued, so he set out to Porto on foot and arrived in early 1119. Unfortunately, Pietro of the Onesti died on March 29th of 1119, so Ubald had little to no interaction and minimal chances to learn from him. So Ubald just copied down the rule and returned home. If you're like me, you're probably wondering, what was this rule and why did Ubald like it so much? Well, here's the rule. It declared that walls needed to be built to surround the clergy house. They had to close the external doors at night. They had to maintain silence in the church, and they couldn't go out more than two at a time. And in order to go out, they needed the prior's permission. Additionally, there were required fastings, Bible readings, acts of charity, and hospitality to those in need. But those are all they come along with the position. And to be honest, except for not being able to leave, they all seem fairly reasonable to me. It's interesting that it was so profound at the time. Only 3 clergymen agreed to these rules when Ubald returned, though, so it was a little bit of a rough start. But through time and dedication, they did reform the community. Unfortunately, in 1126, a fire destroyed Gubbio, and with it, the clergy house of Saint Mariano. Ubald didn't know what to do, and so he fled the monastery to Fonte Avellina. And upon arrival, the prior, Pietro of Rimini, essentially scolded him as you would scold a child for running away or getting in trouble. And he told him that his brothers back home needed him now more than ever. And Ubald realized just how awful of a mistake he made, and he returned home at once. And when he got home, he dedicated his time fully to reconstructing and repairing his clerical house. And in that very same year, Gennaro, the bishop of Perugia, died, and the Perugians chose Ubald as their next bishop. But Ubald didn't want that role. He knew, though, that if the Pope requested him to be the bishop, that he couldn't refuse. You don't just tell the Pope no. So he set out to meet with Pope Honorio II before he had the chance to ask Ubald to become the bishop. And Ubald explained to him the situation when he arrived, and Honorio accepted Ubald's explanation and told the Perusians that they had to choose a different person to be their bishop. Ubald's kind of sounding like someone who doesn't really want responsibility. And I'm sure many, many people can relate to this. Like, it's normal to not want a ton of responsibility. Responsibility causes stress, and who wants extra stress? But guess what? Ubald still had a strong reputation for his faith among the members of his community, despite his actions of sort of running away a couple of times. And he grew past that aversion to leadership eventually. He wasn't born ready to be a leader, but he became one as the need arose. And I think that's something that we can all learn from and use as a source of motivation. So now with that out of the way, let's get back to Ubald's turning point into embracing leadership. In 1129, the bishop for Gubbio, Stefano, died, and so a new bishop was needed in order to succeed him. This decision fell to the Pope, and he remembered his meeting with Ubald a few years earlier, so he made the decision that Ubald would be the next bishop there. Ubald wasn't too pumped about this choice, but he accepted it. Again, like, you don't just say no to the Pope. However, he continued living the same way as before, exceedingly simple and minimal. But many of his family members were kind of frustrated because they thought that with his new position, he'd sort of like hook them up and make their lives a little better. But he didn't. Even some citizens were unhappy because they wanted a bishop that was essentially living like royalty, but that wasn't Ubald's style. He was all about being simple and being minimal. And despite these feelings that Ubald was getting from his family and some of his community members, he never returned their angry sentiments. He never was angry or frustrated back with them. He only showed patience and forgiveness. And this way of life for Ubald persisted for years to come. He endured dislike from many around him because he also had the respect of many others, and he knew he was doing the right thing. And then, in 1140, when the reconstruction of Gubbio was nearing its end, the bricklayers began throwing their trash in Ubald's vineyard. Now, you might be like, oh boy, he's going to get so ticked off. Well, Ubald asked the boss of the bricklayers to not do that. And the boss just kind of insulted Ubald and pushed him. And after he pushed him, Ubald fell into the cement that they were using, and he was just absolutely covered head to toe in cement. He went back to the clergy house to clean off, but he didn't really show any anger whatsoever back at this guy. The people of the town, though, they were furious. And they wanted to punish the guy that pushed their bishop, and they wanted to exile that guy. Ubald came back to them, and he said they couldn't do anything to the man without offending him, Ubald. He said that Jesus had been treated even worse, and he never sought revenge. So he had no right in allowing any level of revenge to happen on his behalf. And this is when the people realized just what kind of bishop they had. Ubald demonstrated his peaceful power once again when a civil war broke out between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Clashes between the two groups began, and they were becoming more and more frequent. Eventually, a nearly full-on battle broke out, and Bishop Ubald was called to the scene to help put a stop to it. Neither side would listen to what he had to say. They just wanted to fight. So he did the only thing that he could do in that circumstance. He stood in between both armies while they were fighting. Then he collapsed to the ground. Both sides stopped nearly instantly, worried that somebody had hurt, or even worse, maybe killed Ubald. As the crowd grew around Ubald's body, he got up. He reprimanded his people for resorting to violence like this and pointed out how quickly they set aside their differences just to make sure he was okay. And so, Ubald stopped a small civil war in an afternoon. But that wasn't the end of conflicts for Ubald. The towns and cities around Gubbio were angered by the prosperity that Gubbio had, which was only worsened by the means to which this was attained. Gubbio found success embracing a more expansionist set of policies, while other towns looked down upon these policies. A total of 11 cities united against Gubbio and decided that they would attack and destroy the city. The people of Gubbio once again turned to Ubald for help, but this situation was much more dire than the last that he dealt with. He attempted to talk to the other cities to reach an agreement, But none of them would allow that to happen. None of them cared. Ubald needed a new strategy. So, in a rather unexpected twist, he turned to arming the people. He told them, God hates sins, but not sinners. Which is true. Sinners can be forgiven and go through penance for their sins if need be. So, Ubald had them endure penance before they could fight. He also pointed out that if the Lord had intentions of freeing us, they cannot do us any harm. If the Lord has decided to punish us, he can destroy us without their help. And for 3 days, the city prayed, recited hymns, and completed their penance. Outnumbered 14-1, they journeyed into the mountains where their attackers had camped, and Ubald's men unleashed a surprise attack, and the opposing army was forced to flee. In their escape, they left behind countless resources, and the people of Gubbio took them back because why just let them go to waste sitting out there? Might as well take them. But wait, there's more. In 1154, Barbarossa was about at the peak of his power, and he had his sights set on conquering Italy. As he traveled the country's cities to flex his power, he would decimate anybody who didn't recognize him as their king. And eventually, he arrived at Gubbio, and many feared that he would destroy the city after he demanded payments that were well in excess of what the city could provide. Ubald, though old and ill at this time, went to meet with Barbarossa. The mere sight of Ubald humbled Barbarossa, and he lowered his head to ask for a blessing. Ubald told him, He who gave you the crown giveth you the right to go to heaven. And in the end, Ubald was given a silver chalice as a gift, and Gubbio was left to be. Whether more was said or not, we don't totally know, but it's clear that enough transpired to really, really resonate with Barbarossa and change his mind about Gubbio. You know, I kind of would love to be able to meet Ubald. He sounds like one of those people who can humble somebody with a look and invoke overwhelming confidence with a smile. You know, it just sounds, all these stories just sound so impressive and incredible. But on Monday, May 16th, 1160, Ubald passed away. The city of Gubbio was devastated. They lost more than just their bishop. They lost somebody who's a close friend to every single person in the city. Ubald's body was adorned with bishop's clothes and laid in the church for the people to visit and pay respects. Pilgrims would come day and night to see the body, but then stories started spreading of miraculous healings for those who touched the body. And despite the warm conditions, Ubald's body did not decay or stink, and this just encouraged more and more pilgrims to visit Ubald. It actually became too much for the city to handle, and they announced that they would have to bury the bishop to ease the stress the town was experiencing. But people were already referring to him as Saint Ubald, even though he hadn't been canonized yet. Giordano and Teobaldo, two biographers at the time, wrote about Ubald's life in 1163, which is why we are so fortunate in knowing so much about the saint. They wrote of how people who visited the body were cured of blindness, deafness, and how crippled people who were visiting the body were suddenly able to walk again. Even after his burial, visitors to the tomb were healed of sicknesses and afflictions. It is even said that people who suffered from torment by demons went to his resting place and were saved. But people weren't finished paying respects to Ubald. In 1194, his body was moved to Mount Ingino, now known as Mountain of Saint Ubaldo, and it was moved there to protect it from invaders. He was left to rest for a while, but then was moved in 1919 to pay thanks to Ubald for protection in World War I. In 1929, it was moved again for the 800th anniversary of Ubald's appointment to bishop, and in 1960 for the 800th anniversary after his death. And in 1986, it was again pulled out in celebration of 900 years after his birth. And finally, it was brought out in 1994 for the 800th anniversary of the transfer of the body in 1194 to keep it safe on the mountain of Saint Ubald. Honestly, it does look remarkably well, and being not preserved, not artificially preserved, for almost 1,000 years, it's pretty crazy. But I really hope he can rest in peace now, and there's not a whole lot more moves that he's going to go through. Now, I have just one final story to share about Saint Ubald, and it's from the town of Thann. Supposedly, Ubald told his servant that when he died, this servant could have his ring. Well, when he died, the servant went to take the ring, but Ubald's whole finger came off. The servant wasn't really sure what to do, kind of panicked, and he ended up hiding the finger in his staff and began his trip back to his homeland. He grew tired eventually and decided to rest in a little safe area underneath the shade of a fir tree. When he awoke, he couldn't move the staff, and he kind of got into a minor panic. There was a castle nearby, and the count of the castle saw flames bursting from the top of a tree. They went to investigate because they thought something terrible could be happening, but they found a man in prayer sitting by a staff. He explained to them what happened, and the count of the castle said that he would build a church on that very spot, and instantly the stick became free. They kept their promise and built some homes and eventually a church, and the town became known as Than. Now, Gubbio still celebrates Ubald every year in May because of everything the saint did for the city. That is how profound of a mark Ubald left behind on his home. They even had an ark made in honor of him. At one point, it contained his reportedly uncorrupt body, but in the 18th century, Ubald was moved to a tomb, and his new memorial was made to honor him because the ark was starting to deteriorate a little bit, and it was deteriorating more than his body was. Ubald was canonized in 1192 by Pope Celestine III. His feast day is May 16th. He's the patron saint of Gubbio, you could probably guess that, against demonic possessions, against migraines, neuralgia, sick children, autism, and people suffering from OCD. And that's because these are all sorts of afflictions that were healed by visiting his body or while he was alive. And that's all I have about Ubald. What do you think about Saint Ubald Baldassini? I hope you found his story as interesting as I did. What are your thoughts on the miracles he performed? What about his ability to resolve conflict? It's pretty impressive for somebody who seemed to hate leadership so early on in his life. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the channel, you can subscribe, download the episode, like, comment, share it with your friends, or send me a suggestion on a saint to check out by emailing me at sanctifiedpodcast@proton.me. You can find the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, Podbean, and more. Just search for the Sanctified Podcast, and I should have some episodes there. If I don't, send me a message or post it somewhere, and I'll do my best to get on whatever hosting platform you're using. Take care, and I hope you have a wonderful day.